Hi, this is Steve Cook, and in this series of videos I'm looking at academic terms which are frequently used in biblical studies. In two previous videos I looked at the term Deuteronomistic and redaction, and in this video I want to bring those two together and look at a term which is sometimes used by scholars in referring to the Deuteronomistic redactional layer or layers that we find in some of the books of the Bible. Now I spoke about how redaction was a process of editing. So our first question really is, what exactly did an editor or a redactor do? Well, one of the things that they did was to obtain information from various sources. And we know this because some of the writers of the Bible, some of the editors, name those sources for us. In the book of Kings, for example, the writer says that he obtained information from the book of Jasher, the book of the Acts of Solomon, the Annals of the Kings of Israel, and the Annals of the Kings of Judah. And sometimes we get this information in the context where he might say, for example, as for the rest of the deeds of King so-and-so, are they not found in the book of the Annals of the Kings of Judah? In doing this, the writer or redactor tells us two things. He tells us that he obtained his information from various sources, but also he tells us that he didn't use all the information that was available to him. So he says, for example, as for the rest of the acts of King so-and-so, are they not found elsewhere? And so he tells us in that way that he was being selective and he only used the information that used his particular purposes, but there was more information that was available to him. Apart from these named sources, scholars think that the writers also drew on other sources which were not named. Some of these may have been oral sources. And they think this because quite often we'll get a block of material in a book which seems different stylistically to the literary context, to the rest of the material that surrounds it. And so it looks like it's a block of material that may have been written or an oral source that the writer has dropped into the story at that point. Some of these sources, for example, in Kings, are the succession narrative, which is about how David is seated to the throne. What we could call the Ark narrative, which is about David taking the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And also some of the stories about the conflict between Saul and David belong to what is often called the Saul-David tradition, which is quite possibly an oral source rather than a written source. So the editor or redactor would bring all these sources together. This list here is not a list of how they would appear in the book of Kings, for example, but I've just merged them together to show that the writer would bring together his various sources. He may then write an introduction of his own. Perhaps a conclusion. He might add some new material that he has sourced from elsewhere. He might insert some linking comments so that all this material flows together coherently as a whole. In doing so, he then might revise and modify some of the existing material that he's got from his sources so that it does flow coherently and so that it does suit his own purposes. A second editor then might add some new material of his own. He too might make some new comments and revise the existing material. That editor could write a new conclusion. Then a third editor could go through the same process, and perhaps a fourth. And so this gives various layers in the document we have. In the case of the Book of Kings, many scholars think that there probably were at least 4 editors at various stages in the history of the composition of the book. So who could we say wrote the books of the Bible? Well, the authors of the original source documents could be regarded as writers. So the writer of Kings tells us, for example, that he obtained some information from the book of Jasher. So Jasher was the writer of that book, then Jasher contributed to the book of Kings as we have it, and that he could be regarded as an author, or at least a source. Also, the originators of oral histories and folk tales in the same way could be regarded as writers or contributors. These source documents were then combined into a single document by an editor or redactor who was probably, or could be regarded as the main writer, at least the first editor, or the editor that made the most substantial changes. Because then there could have been editing done, or further editing done by later redactors or editors or scribes who copied the books and made their own amendments at times. Some books may have several editorial layers as they went through a process of editing with new additions over time. And one of these layers that can be detected in some of the books is what is called the Deuteronomistic redactional layer. An editor, a writer who had a Deuteronomistic way of thinking was involved in the framing. It may not have been the original writer of the book, but was certainly a prominent and important editor at some stage in the redactional process. When was the Deuteronomistic redaction done in these books? Well, in the case of the Book of Kings, for example, we can date when the book was written, or at least we can give it the earliest possible date. The Book of Kings concludes by referring to an event in the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin of Judah. And it is very specific. It says in the 12th month, on the 22nd day of the month, and refers to the king of Babylon and so on. So it's very specific in the dating. We can date this event quite specifically to 562 BCE. And this is the last event recorded in the Book of Kings. So the Book of Kings had to have been written or to have gone through its final editing, to its final redaction when this material was added, no earlier than 562 BCE in the exile of Judah in Babylon. So the Deuteronomistic redaction was probably done while Israel was in exile in Babylon or later. What do we know about the Deuteronomistic redactor? Well, he certainly seems to be anti-monarchic. Some of the material in Kings, for example, and Samuel and Kings, appear to be in favour of kings, but the bulk of the material seems to be against kings, and he's very critical of the kings. And this is attributed to the Deuteronomistic redactor, who appears to be anti-monarchic. He's more favourably inclined to prophets than to priests, in contradistinction to the Book of Chronicles, which seems to be more favourably inclined to priests than to prophets. This redactor seems to have a concern for the poor, the disenfranchised, and for strangers, and may also have contributed to the editing of some prophetic books, in particular the book of Jeremiah, which scholars regard as being very Deuteronomistic, and some scholars think that Jeremiah could in fact have been a Deuteronomistic redactor of the earlier books like Samuel and Kings, and also books like the Book of the 12, called in English Bibles called the Minor Prophets, especially the books of Amos and Hosea, which appear to be very Deuteronomistic. The themes which the Deuteronomistic redactor seem to be dealing with are answering the questions, what was the reason for the exile? And there is an emphasis in these books on rewards and punishments, rewards for obedience, punishment for disobedience. That seems to be an important theme in the Deuteronomistic literature or the redactions. But also answer the question, how should Israel be governed after the exile? And hence he discusses things like how worthwhile was monarchy, and was monarchy good for Israel or not? And also who should guide the nation in exile and when they return to the land, prophets or priests, for example. Why do we need to know this? Well, I think it's helpful because it explains, or helps to explain, some apparent contradictions. And some of the contradictions seem to be simply because the writer has drawn from two different sources, which have told the story quite differently, and has not felt that it was important to smooth out or to resolve the contradictions. It can explain why the text is sometimes disrupted or disjointed, because the material has been dropped in at that point and doesn't necessarily line up neatly with its surrounding context. But most importantly, in my mind, was knowing this helps us to understand what was going on in the writer's world that prompted these books to be written or to be edited at this point of time. I hope that's helpful. Please feel free to send me an email or to contact me through the contact form or to make a comment below, and I'm more than happy to give you my ideas, my opinions on any of this. So please feel free to be engaged in the conversation and to make your own contribution. Bye.